Some people say I have trust issues, but look, basically, I just don't trust stairs. They're always up to something. Hey guys, welcome back. Man, it is good to see you. I hope you're excited for the Harlem Renaissance. It is one of my favorite things to read about and talk about. You may have noticed my mic, and my headset's gone. I have a story to tell, but you may have to wait till the next episode to hear it. For now, you just have to endure the ugliness that is this homemade MacGyver microphone. Let's get into the lesson. All right, so here's what we're going to do today. Today, you're going to be able to describe what the Harlem Renaissance was, first of all, because you probably have no idea what I'm talking about when I say the Harlem Renaissance. But some of you may know that Harlem, if you've ever heard of the Harlem Globetrotters, they're like a trick shot basketball team. They're pretty cool. Harlem is a part of New York. It's a neighborhood in New York City, and we're going to talk about more in depth of what that is. We're also going to explain how the Harlem Renaissance happened. And finally, we're going to infer or read between the lines or guess at its importance to African Americans' role in America's culture. Okay, so African Americans made a big impact on our culture through the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll look at that today. All right, so what are you going to need for your lesson today? You're only going to need a couple of things. You're going to need the article Harlem Renaissance from history.com. And there's a link here. You probably can't click on it, but if you need to zoom in and type it in, you can. Otherwise, it's this thing right here that I passed out in class. You should have a copy of that. You can find it online pretty easily if you Google HarlemRenaissanceHistory.com, and you'll see that article with this picture on it. You will also need the Introduction to the Harlem Renaissance worksheet, and that is right here. This worksheet. Okay. And we'll be taking notes kind of as we go through here, and I'll guide you through how we're going to do that. One last thing I want to check on is that you guys have your checklist in front of you, that you at least take a look at it and kind of make sure you have everything you need for this whole lesson. So on your checklist, you'll be doing a couple different things, but just make sure you have that main checklist in front of you kind of throughout the week so you can go back and check and make sure you're getting everything done for every lesson that you need to. Okay, so you have everything you need. Now, I do want to have a conversation before we start, a pretty serious conversation about offensive language. So we're going to see in this unit about the Harlem Renaissance, there's a lot of material by African Americans, and we see African Americans trying to process their role in American culture and history. And because of that, there are some words and things that come up that can be very offensive in modern day. But let's talk about this, okay? So times change, first of all. So lots of terms that were offensive in the past, many terms that were offensive now, things that are offensive now, were not as offensive in the past. So we need to keep that in mind. We're going to see certain African Americans actually using words about themselves that we would never use today. And we have to understand that these words didn't mean what they mean today. And African American may have called themselves this in the past, but they won't call themselves this now. And we certainly, as young people, shouldn't be using this language in any way to offend people. Some terms have always been offensive. Okay, so some words they were offensive then, they're offensive now, but writers will intentionally use offensive language sometimes to get a point across. So when an author uses this, they're being very careful with the way they're using it. They're trying to convey a very specific message. They're not just throwing out name calling. So when we see writers using these terms, that does not give us permission to just shout them down the hallway or anything like that. Okay, we need to be mature and say there's a time and there's a place. And there is a time and place for the way these authors use them in a very specific way, and we need to understand that and realize that that doesn't give us permission to use these terms, all the time. So, for example, a term such as Negro will appear many times in this unit. This is one of those terms that was not offensive to African Americans at the time, but is very offensive now. You would never call somebody this. It's just don't do it. It's like it's very rude, so don't do it. We want to be sensitive to the struggles of African Americans, what they've been through, and we also just want to be people who represent kindness and grace, and so we don't want to use it in an offensive way at all. Now, we should understand it was acceptable like 100 years ago, but it's very offensive in current times. We don't want to use them, like I said. In class, this word may come up, and I would ask that if it does come up, that it's used maturely. For instance, the title of a poem. We have a title of the poem called "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." And it's okay if we're in class and you want to mention the poem. I think this poem, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers," is a great poem or whatever, because it is the title of the poem. So we're using it appropriately. An inappropriate use of this word would just be shouting it over and over. Okay, like that's not okay. And, you have to think of it this way. I'll give you an example. If there was a guy who walked up to you and cut your arm with a knife and started messing with your bones inside your wrist, you would freak out, right? That would be completely inappropriate. But if you went to a doctor's office and you had a broken arm and a doctor went in and cut your wrist open with a scalpel and was trying to fix things, that would be completely appropriate. So there's a time and place for everything, okay? And when we're in a classroom setting talking about poetry and literature and deep ideas, it's okay to use the scalpel. It's okay to use the knife. It's like that's the appropriate setting for us to talk about these ideas, okay? When you're joking around with your friends in the hallway, or you're texting somebody and you're trying to get a point across and you're being goofy, that is not an appropriate time to use these words, okay? Cool. Any questions, just ask me. Let's move on. All right, so you might ask what Harlem Renaissance means. So let's look at that first, because that's important. Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City. So there are lots of neighborhoods in New York City, but this is a really this is a pretty big neighborhood, and we'll read more about specifically what it was here in just a moment. And Renaissance means a cultural rebirth. It's like usually an explosion of art, literature, music, and more. Renaissance really means rebirth, and so that's the idea. There's several renaissances we look at in history, and one of them was Da Vinci, the painting guy. That was a renaissance, and this was one we call the Harlem Renaissance. It's a renaissance or rebirth that happened in the neighborhood of Harlem. All right, so we're going to go ahead and read this article. You should have it out in front of you. We're going to stop at each section to discuss. So what I'll ask you to do is I'll ask you to pause the video at certain times and write in your notes here. You should have your article and your introduction to the Harlem Renaissance in front of you. This little guy right here. And you're going to be filling out notes and at the same time reading along. So, by the way, take note of any words you don't recognize. Go ahead and circle them in the text. You can be underlining key ideas as we go as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading. Where it says Harlem Renaissance, History.com editors. So the Harlem Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century and subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted. Lasting roughly from the 1910s through the mid-1930s, the period is considered a golden age in African American culture, manifesting in literature, music, stage performance, and art. All right, so we're going to go ahead and fill in the first question on our Introduction to Renaissance sheet, which is, what is the Harlem Renaissance? And pause the video. You can go ahead and fill that in. All right, thanks for pausing the video. Now, you're back, and if you're not sure exactly what this paragraph means, if we see the word Mecca, Mecca means the center of something. So it became the cultural center for African Americans in the 20th century. And there was an explosion of art and culture that came from that. So it's a time of extreme beautiful culture and art and poetry and music and dance and clubs and all kinds of things that African Americans did not have up to that point. You know, the Civil War was over for not that long, and many blacks were still living in the South, really oppressed. So let's go ahead and look here at the Great Migration. The northern Manhattan neighborhood of Harlem was meant to be an upper-class white neighborhood in the 1880s, but rapid overdevelopment or overbuilding led to empty buildings and desperate landlords seeking to fill them. Next page. In the early 1900s, a few middle-class black families from another neighborhood known as Black Bohemia moved to Harlem, and other black families followed. Some white residents initially fought to keep African Americans out of the area, but failing that, many whites eventually fled. Outside factors led to a population boom. From 1910 to 1920, African American populations migrated in large numbers from the south to the north, with prominent figures like W.E.B. Du Bois leading what became known as the Great Migration. In 1915 and 1916, natural disasters in the South put black workers and sharecroppers out of work. Additionally, during and after World War I, immigration to the United States fell, and the northern recruiters headed south to entice black workers to their companies. By 1920, some 300,000 African Americans from the South had moved north, and Harlem was one of the most popular destinations for these families. Let's push pause there in just a second, actually. So we're going to go ahead and answer this question, what happened to the African American population in Harlem from 1900 or from 1910 to 1920. Push the pause on the video and answer that question on your worksheet. All right, so let's look at this next section. Langston Hughes. This considerable population shift resulted in a Black Pride movement, with leaders like Du Bois working to ensure that Black Americans got the credit they deserved for cultural areas of life. Two of the earliest breakthroughs were in poetry, with Claude McKay's collection Harlem Shadows in 1922 and Jean Toomer's Cain in 1923. Civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man in 1912, followed by God's Trombones, took me a second with that word, God's Trombones 1927, left their mark on the world of fiction. Novelist and Du Bois protege Jesse Redmond Fawcett's 1924 novel, There Is Confusion, explored the idea of Black Americans finding a cultural identity in a white-dominated Manhattan. Fawcett was literary editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, and developed a magazine for black children with Du Bois. Sociologist Charles Spurgeon Johnson, who was integral in shaping the Harlem literary scene, used the debut party for There Is Confusion to organize resources to create, quote, opportunity. The National Urban League magazine he founded and edited, a success that bolstered writers like Langston Hughes. So these guys were coming up with all of these magazines for blacks because there was no such thing before this. And so they were African Americans helping African Americans make magazines, and then writers like Langston Hughes were writing for these magazines and publishing them, and African Americans were reading them. So you can guess that they were starting to develop their literary culture. Hughes was at the party, along with other promising black writers and editors, as well as a powerful white New York publishing figures. Soon, many writers found their work appearing in mainstream magazines like Harper's. So push pause here. Let's look at the two poetry collections. It's up near it's in that first paragraph. Let's look at the two poetry collections. Go ahead and write that down. Push pause if you need to. All right, now we come to one of my favorite human beings of all time, Zora Neale Hurston. She's amazing. She's a really interesting person. So let's read about her. Zora Neale Hurston, anthropologist, that means someone who studies people and culture, and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston courted controversy through her involvement with a publication called Fire. Let's look at this phrasing here and see what we can learn about her. In fact, this is a question. What can we learn about her? Courted controversy. She courted controversy. What does this word courted mean? Any ideas? It's an old-fashioned word meaning dating. Like you would date someone, you'd court someone. You'd want to get to know them better. Okay, so you'd spend a lot of time with them to get to know them better. And so courting meant she spent a lot of time getting really close with controversy. And what is controversy? Controversy is like the tension in society or debates and things that people get really upset about. So she spent a lot of time getting really close to things that people got really upset about. And she was involved with a publication. It was like a magazine called Fire, all caps, exclamation points. Fire, all caps, exclamation points. So what can we learn? What do you think Zora Neale Hurston's all about? Just from that. Push pause and go and write down your answer. What do you think Zora Neale Hurston was like based off of that information? Pause there. All right. Welcome back. So let's read more about this publication called Fire. Second paragraph. Helmed, that means run by, helmed by white author and Harlem writers patron Carl van Vechten, the magazine exoticized the lives of Harlem residents. It means it made their lives look really amazing and intense and interesting. Van Vechten's previous fiction stirred up interest among whites to visit Harlem and take advantage of the cultural and nightlife there. So they're publishing this magazine, and a bunch of white people are like, oh, this sounds really interesting. Harlem sounds amazing. There's a lot of African Americans there, but it sounds like there's some really cool stuff going on. So let's read more. Though Van Vechten's work was condemned by older luminaries like Du Bois, it was embraced by Hurston, Hughes, and others. So there's a bit of an argument going on because this white guy runs Fire along with Zora Neale Hurston. She's black. And some of the older African Americans who started the Harlem Renaissance, they were like, what's this guy doing? Why is he trying to bring a bunch of white people into the city? But Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes were like, yeah, bring them on. Let's have a party. Bring everybody into Harlem. So it's really interesting. So let's go to the next page. We're going to skip the paragraph that says County Cullen. Okay. And we're going to go to Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong at the bottom. The music that percolated in and then boomed out of Harlem in the 1920s was jazz, often played at speakeasies, offering illegal liquor. A speakeasy. What's a speakeasy? What do they do at a speakeasy? They offer illegal liquor, and what else is going on there? What kind of music? Jazz. African Americans invented jazz, right? And Harlem was where it happened. So jazz became a great draw for not only Harlem residents, but outside white audiences also. So you have these, sorry, we'll keep reading. Go to the next page. We'll keep reading and then I'll explain it. Some of the most celebrated names in American music regularly performed in Harlem: Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Fats Waller, and Cab Calloway. often accompanied by elaborate floor shows. Tap dancers like John Bubbles and Bill Bojangles Robinson were also popular. Wow, you're named like Bill Bojangles Robinson and you think that's crazy, but like we have Lady Gaga. So maybe it's not so crazy. So here's what happened. There's a lot of really interesting music going on in Harlem, and a bunch of whites are going there to see what's going on. And the only clubs they have they're black clubs. So the whites just come into the black clubs, and at the time, liquor was illegal. You could not buy alcohol in the United States. I mean, liquor was illegal. It was considered a poison. And so there was all this illegal liquor. You know, you had to like sneak into these clubs and speak a code word to get in. And then inside, you had whites and blacks mixing, listening to this amazing music. So racism really started to fall apart in New York at this time. So now let's look at the Cotton Club. Oh, by the way, you should answer those next two questions. What was offered at speakeasies? And jazz drew black residents, but who else did it draw in? You should know the answer to that. Push the video and fill it in. Okay, so let's look now. Why was the Cotton Club formed? Cotton Club. With the groundbreaking new music came a vibrant nightlife. The Savoy opened in 1927, an integrated ballroom. That means blacks and whites they're integrated, they come together. An integrated ballroom with 2 bandstands that featured continuous jazz and dancing well past midnight, sometimes in the form of battling bands helmed by Fletcher Henderson, Jimmy Lunsford, I'm not sure about that guy, and King Oliver. While it was fashionable to frequent Harlem nightlife, entrepreneurs, this is like wealthy business people, entrepreneurs realized that some white people wanted to experience black culture without having to socialize with African Americans. So like, we like the jazz, but not the blacks, is basically what these rich business people realized. So they created clubs to cater to them. The most successful of these clubs was called the Cotton Club, which featured frequent performances by Ellington and Calloway. Some in the community derided the existence of such clubs. That means they hated it and they said so. While others believed they were a sign that black culture was moving toward greater acceptance. So they saw it this way. There were these white clubs. They said, okay, let's make some white-only clubs, but let's have jazz. And we'll have some black musicians there, but blacks aren't allowed to come in. And so some African Americans saw that and they said, that's horrible. This is a step backwards. What, they're going to keep us out of the club now? But then other blacks said, actually, this is a pretty big deal because whites are starting to listen to our music. Even though they don't want us around right now, the more they listen to our music, the more they're going to want to be around us. So there was some debate about this. So look at the question, why was the Cotton Club formed? And I want you to infer why it was called the Cotton Club. Think about it for a minute. Why was it called the Cotton Club? Go ahead and fill those in. Pause the video. Okay, let's look at what happened in 1929 to end the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to skip over Paul Robeson. We're going to skip over Josephine Baker. We're going to skip over Aaron Douglas. And on the next page, we're going to skip over Marcus Garvey. And we're going to go to the end of the Harlem Renaissance. So it lasted about 10 years, about 10 or 15 years. And let's find out what happened to end it, okay? So the end of Harlem's creative boom began with the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. Now, I don't know if you've talked about this yet in history, but something happened in 1929 very similar to what happened to us when COVID hit. The stock market, all these companies just, woof, all their money just disappeared. And it didn't come back for a long time. The country was incredibly poor. There were people just starving everywhere. It was a big mess. It was a big mess for a lot of reasons. It had nothing to do with Harlem. It just had everything to do with a whole bunch of things going on in the country at the time. So, but that's what happened. So there was a stock market crash. And then the Harlem Renaissance wavered until prohibition ended. That was the ban on alcohol. Till the ban on alcohol ended in 1933, which meant white patrons no longer sought out illegal alcohol in uptown clubs. They were like, oh, these black clubs aren't the only ones serving alcohol anymore. Peace out. See you guys later. So the next paragraph. By 1935, many pivotal Harlem residents had moved on to seek work. They were replaced by the continuous flow of refugees from the South, many requiring public assistance. The Harlem Race Riot of 1935 broke out following the arrest of a young shoplifter, resulting in 3 dead and hundreds injured and millions of dollars in property damage. The riot was a death knell for the Harlem Renaissance. So essentially something happened in Harlem. I read about this. It's very interesting. You can look at it, read it on your own if you want to. 1935 race riot. Basically a kid was caught shoplifting, an African-American kid was caught shoplifting. And the store owners, I don't know if they were white or something else, but they weren't, I don't think they were black. And they held on to the kid and wouldn't let him go, and they called the police. Well, a lot of African Americans were there, and they were like, hey, we're going to make sure you don't beat up this kid. And so African Americans were there to try to protect the kid who shoplifted. But the store owners got really scared of a giant mob that was forming, so they let the kid go through the back. They let him go through the back of the store. And the mob got so big that they weren't understanding what was happening, and they thought the kid had been kidnapped by the police because he wasn't in the store anymore. So there was giant riots and everything, and the news media reported it wrong at the time. They said the kid was kidnapped by police. It was just a big old mess. So that's very interesting to read about, especially in our current times. You should answer the questions on your page that have to do with that, so push pause and do that. All right, last but not least, the impact of the Harlem Renaissance at the bottom of page 5. The Harlem Renaissance was a golden age for African American artists, writers, and musicians. It gave these artists pride in and control over how the Black experience was represented in American culture, and it set the stage for the civil rights movement. This is when African Americans got a lot of voting rights and protections under the law that they have today. So go ahead and finish the last thought on your page there, and I want you to think about this last question. What did African Americans gain as a result of the Harlem Renaissance? You can think big picture. It's not exactly in the text, but what do you think they gained? I mean, they came from being slaves, like owned by whites, to refugees, right? The Civil War ended and they were set free, but like set free to do what? They didn't have homes. They didn't really have jobs. It was like, what are we going to do? And then the Harlem Renaissance happened. So in your opinion, what did they gain because of the Harlem Renaissance? All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This is a little bit of a different lesson where we just kind of ran in there and did what we could, but I think we got it done. So today you described what the Harlem Renaissance was, you explained how it happened, and you inferred its importance to African Americans' role in America's culture. So seeing, I think, what African Americans did for themselves can be an inspiration for anybody when you look at the Harlem Renaissance. And hopefully you get to see some of that beauty as we look at these poems and essays. So meet me in the next lesson.